we're now here for the Q&A. We've got about 21 minutes to go. Glad everyone's managed to stick with us through the technical problems that we've had. And also just thanks to Mike, Axon, Sam Lee and Oliver Johnson for great presentations. Thank you all. So I'm Jason Torrance. I'm going to be chairing the next 20 or so minutes. I'm the Assistant Chief Exec at UK 100. We're a UK network of local and combined authority leaders committed to ambitious action towards net zero and clean air. So we've got a number of questions already submitted. I'd encourage everyone to submit any questions if you haven't done so already. But I just want to use my kind of chair's prerogative first and ask a question to all of you, really, Sam, Mike and Oliver in turn, really. So great presentations. I think you all, in your different ways, talked about the urgency of action that's needed. And what do you think are the big priorities that national government and local government need to take in the next few years to really accelerate the rapid shift we need towards decarbonised transport? So if I can ask Mike first, Sam and then Oliver.
Yeah, well, thank you very much indeed for that, Jason. First thing I'd say is that we need to understand that if we're going to actually achieve this, we do need to make these big plans and not little plans. So it's not a case of changing the light bulbs. It's a case of doing something that actually makes a difference. And in many locations, people are doing that. But to some extent, you sometimes see a little bit of a pushback, if you like, the Magnolia approach, which is don't do too much because it might upset some people. Some people, frankly, probably are going to see some perceived inconvenience, whereas others are going to see bigger convenience. And to some extent, we need to be bold with what we're doing. We are seeing these attitudes changing, but not everybody is going to be keen on it. And so maybe actually be bold, do some of the things that we think are necessary in order to hit these climate targets. And to some extent, that means pushing forward faster than maybe in the past we have done with some slightly more controversial ideas. Yeah, great. Thanks, Mike. Over to you, Sam.
Yeah, I think it's a very difficult question to answer. I wish I had the answer to that, because then I can, invest in the right areas. I think that the core thing is, as I touched on the presentation, is that kind of real-time data will help us make decisions in terms of long-term investment. I think with the COVID pandemic, it's accelerated some of the behavior changes, but I think at current, we don't know whether or not that's for the better or for the worse. I think there's this assumption that, less people traveling to work and commuting is a benefit, but actually when we work out the wider kind of environmental agenda, people heating their own homes during the winter period might not be kind of economically viable and help us tackle that decarbonisation agenda. So I think there are things that we definitely should be looking at, and we are looking at local government around kind of the low-hanging fruits, behaviour that have changed that are definitely beneficial and align with our wider decarbonisation agenda and clean air agenda. So things like adoption and increased utilisation of active travel, we're looking at how do we make some of that behaviour stick as a whole. And kind of sharing of assets, and micromobility has exploded, during the pandemic with electric scooters trial at a national level as well. So it's these different components and understanding kind of where they fit right now, and how we get those behaviour to stick and transition people to public transport more. I think there's still a question around freight, which we still have a lot of unknowns on, but we need to start working out how we capture the insights and creating intervention that fits.
Great, thank you, Sam. Oliver.
Sure, I think obviously Mike and Sam have covered some key points in there, and I certainly think the big picture steps that need to be made in terms of Obviously, we're majoring on electrification, but a lot, obviously, people would talk about other fuel types maybe used in conjunction with electrification. So I don't think electrification will go away. So the need to charge electric vehicles will always be there. And maybe some of the larger freight and heavy lifting may be done by hybrid, which would be a combination of electric and maybe hydrogen or alternative fuel sources. So I think some of the big steps that need to be taken in terms of electrical infrastructure, both in terms of generation as a zero carbon generation, and also storage, and then also delivering electricity into the networks at the right points that allows people to use their vehicles or use transportation or use public transportation, which is electrified, is all going to help in that mix. So it's not a one size fits all, but I think electricity has been as a transportable commodity without any actual emissions or tailpipe emissions is a key enabler. And quite what the mix is in the end, I don't know, but that one's definitely a goer. And I don't think anybody can dispute that, despite the fact at the moment we're only at about 1% of cars. So there's a massive growth in that space to happen, and there's a massive growth in how that's managed. And I think most of the statistics say I think in my talk we talk about having, say, 30 million cars at the moment, that possibly reducing to 20 million cars. So that's going to reduce, and the type of use and the transportation is going to change. So I think the whole shift into electricity, plus people being aware of that, and maybe they're changing people the way just they get around their urban landscapes, which has been changed. And I think, again, pandemic, the amount of cycle lanes that I swore at in my local area, but there's bits of the road, as a cyclist myself, they could have spent all that money and improved, say, 2 key pinch points in my local area, which would have enabled better road use and better possibly bicycle use, would be much better thought out. So I think that some of the small changes on top of the big changes, the small changes that are intelligently thought out and actioned and achieved in the short term, along with the big changes stuck on top of it, is really important. And I think the adoption of electric vehicles in local delivery, larger transportation, we're working in lots of different projects. A lot of the buses are going electric now. So I think there's a whole shift for clean air, and that will obviously help. And then hopefully we need as a country to generate more electricity in a more sustainable way to fuel those vehicles and use them as storage devices for the future. And I think then that's definitely an enabler for the future.
Great. Yeah, thank you for that, Oliver. And thanks everyone. So we've got about just over 13 minutes to go, and I'm just going to open it up for and go on to the questions and encourage people to submit any questions if they haven't done so already. So I've got 2 questions around mobility hubs, which I'm going to ask you, Sam, to lead off on, but then Oliver and Mike, if you want to come in afterwards. So there's a question from Martin Bignell first, which is, should there be an operator of mobility hubs? If so, is this better as a public sector council run thing or a commercial operator? And associated to that, should there be revenue streams related to covering costs? And I suppose connected to that, do mobility hubs and EV charging network viability work commercially in rural locations? So a question about operators, who should operate them, and do they work in both urban and rural areas? Sam.
So I'll tackle the rural one last, because that one's a bit more difficult to answer. Well, they're both really difficult to answer. I think the first thing to touch on is mobility hub is really a new concept. I think traditionally we've been thinking about transport in terms of park and ride site and car parking and enabling kind of public to utilize public transport, whereas now we're reducing that need to travel further than, to access services more locally as a whole. In terms of the question around should public sector be an operator, there's a lot of unknowns at the moment, and this is why we're working on the eHubs project to really understand what are the critical components as a foundation that a mobility hub needs to have. that includes charging infrastructure as well. Because when I talk about kind of the mobility hub, I know I mentioned kind of car clubs, but it could also be a rapid charging point, for personal owned vehicles as well, as a whole. I don't think there is enough data to really work out what the commercial model looks like at the moment, but we're keen on exploring how to make that commercially sustainable, and in some ways it links into the wider question around, is car parking still kind of fit for purpose? Should we be transitioning those into mobility hubs and actually providing a better service to local communities and so on and so forth? So, yeah, I don't have an answer just yet, but I know for a fact that there is a lot of interest in the private sector, especially in the startup space, with players like Reef, where they are providing that mobility hub as a service proposition, and they have worked out the business models behind it. But from a public sector perspective, we're still lagging behind a little bit because of no real world implementation and how people would utilize it. I think on the question around rural, it's a difficult one to answer. I think it comes back to how energy is being generated at the moment. I think the energy system, how it's set up at the moment, is catered for getting power into kind of the regional centres and so on and so forth. And if we are to enable this electrification of all our transport provision, that needs to change. And I think with that change will come a better provision for rural charging as well. And I think people sometimes forget that the range of those electric vehicles are pretty good. You don't necessarily need to be charging them at home. You can be charging them, when you get to the destination that you're accessing the service on, whether or not it's health, whether or not it's other propositions. So, yeah, I think two sides, as I say, the improvement in the energy system will change that, as well as, the confidence on electric vehicles range will change that as well in terms of requirements and needs.
Great, thank you, Sam. So Mike or Oliver, any points from you? Mike, yeah, you need to take your mute off.
Crikey, it's that Teams 101, wasn't it? So, I'm sorry about that, guys. As far as I'm concerned, the answer is a firm yes in most circumstances, because what we're looking at with mobility hubs is they're not really mobility hubs. They are community hubs, and they're doing lots of different things. And so we're designing into where we're putting them in community concierge. And that's a team of people that does more than just rent you a bike. They will, for instance, be a travel plan officer for a school. They'll sell you a cup of coffee. It'll be the place you go for your wildlife walk from. It may be the place that you attach to your third place, which is the place you go to work when you're working from home but don't want to. So, for instance, one practical example, we're looking at one in the Midlands at the moment where it's exactly that. This mobility hub is going to be a community hub within the local centre, and it's going to have community concierge people there. It's going to be the place where your parcel goes and you pick it up if you live in the community. And these people are going to be the people that effectively glue the community together. So very much so, I think that primary hubs, yes, there should be an operator. Who are those operators? Well, we've been talking to developers and house builders about different types. So, for instance, in this particular case, we're talking about a local charity, a community charity that wants to get involved. The funding comes from a combination. So where we're looking, this is a new sustainable urban extension. So some of the funding from the urban extension goes into funding the community concierge and the mobility hub. And frankly, it's not that much money compared to what you might otherwise spend your money on. Otherwise, we'd be looking at models where you actually make money out of renting the bikes, doing all of this stuff as well. So there are now models that people are starting to build to turn these into sort of commercial models. And if you look at places like Bremen, I think, Sam, you might know better than me, but I think they've got an eight-year return on the sort of pump priming for some of these secondary mobility hubs. So very much so. Long answer, yes.
Okay, thank you, Mike. Oliver.
Sure. So I think the sort of the micro mobility hub or the location, I think you both, Mike and Sam, have touched on it, is typically where someone may go to do their post office, drop their kids off, do something else. It needs to be a multi-purpose reason for being there. And again, with car charging and vehicle charging, we always say it's better to be doing something useful than just sitting in your car while it's charging, because, you know, even if that's drinking a cup of coffee and having a chat and reading a newspaper, it's better than just standing around or sitting in your car waiting for your car to charge. So, of course, these types of facilities that are there and that can support people who don't have off-street parking, etc. And I think these can also quite easily be mobilised into rural areas where possibly the density is probably more useful in some ways, because sometimes in the dense urban environment there's been so much demand for vehicle charging, you need to kind of build it on a slightly different scale. You've only got to look at the grid serve location in Braintree, which is next to a major conurbation, that can quite easily get busy as the electrification goes on, and you look at the number of people owning cars that don't have off-street parking. So I think they can scale quite quickly into the urban environment. And again, you've mentioned it before, the availability of grid electricity in those locations can be an issue, but there's ways to solve that as well. So yeah, I think all the use cases are valid, and I think some of the more dense urban mobility hubs will quite quickly become congested with electric vehicles if there's just 1 or 2 or 3 spaces for charging. As we transition in the next sort of 2-3 years, then I think there needs to be some slight forward factoring in those areas, so there's the scope for growth in those ones to become useful for the long term, not just for the what's on the street at the moment. You know, it used to be even 3 years ago in the e-mobility space, you drive down the street and maybe once every 2 or 3 days you might be lucky enough to see an EV, whereas now they're everywhere. You know, so it's a completely different scape. So the charging capability and the charging demand will certainly increase dramatically for these types of micromobility hubs.
Great, thank you, everyone. And can I just move on to another set of questions around EVs, and perhaps start with you, Oliver. So Max Botchen has asked, what are fleet operators' main obstacles, problems, issues from a charging perspective? And linked to that, John Carr has asked, what are the limits to electrification of the car fleet? Hopefully, given the scale of the challenge of the sky's the limit, but I think
sure.
In terms of rare metals for batteries and stuff. So
sure.
I think fleet and broad issues.
Yeah, so just from a sort of case study point of view, as ABB in the UK, we've got approximately 450 cars, which are company cars. And we've made a commitment to swap all of those out at the end of the lease. So by the end of 2023, we should be fully electric in the UK, and we've teamed up with Centrica to install our home charging units for our employees as a managed service, not us doing it directly. And then all the cars are transitioned to EV. So all those types of things are possible. There are exceptions, of course, but in general, it is possible. And then when you look at, so that's sort of looking at what I would call sort of traditional company car fleet drivers. When you look at fleet, when it comes to, you know, the post office, DPD, Amazon delivery lorries, last mile deliveries for basically delivering food into your micro hubs or whatever it is, then all of those things can be scaled up as well. And the biggest issue there, again, is getting electricity supplies into those depots, which makes those journeys viable electric in an electric kind of way. In terms of the sort of you know, how far can you go? I'm not a rare earth metal type expert, so people telling me there's boreholes going down in Cornwall where they're getting some fantastic liquid out that they can then boil off and make more substances to build more batteries, which is fantastic. But again, that's the big commerce guys are the guys, and the scientists and the physicists are probably better able to answer those types of questions. But I think the technology will keep evolving dramatically. So I think the amount of those raw materials you need to produce the core stuff, and then again, we talk later on about hybridization, alternate fuel sources, which might then again extend the range of making, say, long distance vehicle trucks, etc. But the large trucks are coming already without hybridization, just with larger battery packs. But the technology will move very quickly.
Great, thank you. And I suppose, as each of you said in different ways in your presentations, it's both about supporting the rapid shift to electric vehicles, but also supporting other forms that may be walking and cycling or bus travel as well. So it's about reducing car travel, I think, as well. I've got another really interesting question. We've got just over a minute left. And Mike and Sam, if it's okay, I think I'd just like to do a last closing question for each of you, which is a really interesting question around, we speak about the need for active and sustainable travel and more broadly a shift to alternatives ways of moving around. Many people are concerned about the rapid pace of this change and the effect and that it's having on their communities. How do we make sure we listen to everyone? So if I can just have kind of 10 seconds, kind of each quick response.
Do you want to go first, Mike? I'll go first. You need to unmute though after I go. I think that the key point is that bringing the customer along for the ride. I think traditionally infrastructure tends to be, we do a bit of consultation, we throw it in, right? It needs to be a community driven scheme, kind of similar to what Mike's been doing, you know, through the concierge and so on and so forth. So it is co-creating, co-designing with the local communities to their needs so that it's inclusive. Mike?
Right.
Consult, but then decide.
I think we're about to get cut off, so that's bad chairing on my part. I'm sorry. So Mike, let's go until we get cut off.
Very simple. Consult, but then decide. You won't satisfy everybody.
Thank you, Oliver.
Yeah, the same thing. Yeah, get people moving around on their own mode of transport. That's better for everybody, and then just move things on and keep pushing the change on a slow basis, and that people can adapt slowly, and you're inclusive of everybody. Great.
Thank you, everyone. Assuming we're still running live, thank you each of you, Mike, Sam, and Oliver. It's been a really great session. Thank you to everyone that submitted questions. We've now got the second set of breakout sessions, switching to electric and achieving modal shift. And you can join these sessions using the agenda and live streams tabs. So thank you very much, and look forward to seeing you all again, hopefully soon.